If my opponent wishes to prove that, as stated, all involuntary impositions of will are immoral, then he truly has a monumental task ahead of him. Given the absolute language of all, as opposed to most or even some, it is not merely sufficient to demonstrate or even irrefutably prove that some or even most involuntary impositions are immoral. No, he must in fact reasonably demonstrate that all, meaning 100%, are immoral. Not even 99.99% would be sufficient to satisfy that complete burden of proof. On the contrary, my burden of proof is to demonstrate that one involuntary imposition could be reasonably categorized as either morally positive or morally neutral, then the affirmative position has failed to satisfy its burden of proof. Therefore, the first matter in which my opponent's hypothesis fails is in seeking to assert a posture of objectivity without satisfying the four basic criteria of an objectively moral claim. Number one, conciseness. An objectively moral claim is simple to communicate and adjudicate. Number two, contextual. An objectively moral claim is jurisdictional and authoritative. Number three, commensurate. An objectively moral claim is neither excessively liberative nor excessively oppressive in either its regulation or its enforcement. Number four, compatible. An objectively moral claim is reasonably aligned with experiential reality. These four criteria, like the four legs of a stool, are primary basic essentials of an objectively moral claim. All four must be demonstrably intact. If any one of the four is missing, then the moral claim is subsequently not objective, but subjective. On first glance, my opponent's hypothesis seems to pass the test of conciseness. It is demonstrably simple to communicate. This is credit to its brevity and alliterative word choice. However, problems begin to emerge when you examine the word choice more closely. Merriam-Webster defines the word imposition as either a verb or a noun, being the action or process of being imposed, and a thing that is imposed, in particular an unfair or unwelcome demand or burden. I personally find it to be less than ideally helpful when a word is itself used in its own definition. Therefore, the word imposed is further defined by Merriam-Webster as a noun and a verb as follows. Force, something unwelcome or unfamiliar to be accepted or to be put in place, and to take advantage of by demand of attention or commitment. Note the prominent use of clearly subjective language in both definition being unfair, unwelcome 2 times, and unfamiliar. This imposes numerous complications upon the hypothesis. Unfair, unwelcome, and unfamiliar are contingent descriptors, dictated by individual experience, dictated by emotional circumstances. There are no objective rules or principles that can quantify whether an action or actor will be objectively unwelcome or objectively unfamiliar. This makes it impossible for determining when it has properly occurred, thus failing the adjudication criteria of conciseness. That one missing leg is sufficient to collapse the entire stool of his hypothesis, but it is not the only weakness. The inherent subjectiveness of it makes it impossible to establish commensurate regulations, enforcements, and punitive recourses for such an imposition. Additionally, there is no rational explanation for how any of those things could be logically determined or applied without them themselves being involuntary impositions on actors or actions. With two legs down, my opponent will likely retreat into familiar philosophical territory, the best possible world gambit, a dressed up version of the imagination game that went to college. It amounts to daydreaming about a world that doesn't exist and then making wild leaps of logic in order to indict our shared experiential reality when it fails, in contrast to the Barbie dream world that has been created out of whole cloth. In all seriousness, conjecturing about ways and means to make the world as we know it better is an honorable endeavor. However, it must remain carefully grounded in rational logic. One way to do this is to not assume that unreasonably impossible things as a standard of judgment, such as everyone having their own personal universe, thus leaving the affirmative hypothesis with naught but a leg to stand on.